The Galactic Council had ruled for 17,000 years, and nobody remembered a time before them anymore. Sitting in their massive crystal station that floated between the stars like a jewel, representatives from 400 different alien species gathered under lights that had burned since humans were still living in caves on Earth. And the 5 thrones at the center belonged to the 5 most powerful empires in the galaxy, who called themselves the Eternal Five, because they believed their power would never end. Commander Jake Morrison stood at the entrance wearing his Terran Federation uniform, and next to him Ambassador Lisa Grant checked her translation device, while alien eyes from every direction watched them walk forward into the grand chamber where gravity shifted in different sections to accommodate species from different worlds, and the air changed composition in bubbles so everyone could breathe what they needed. High Arbiter Velkoth of the Vexhari sat on the first throne with his forearms folded across his chitinous body that looked like black armor, and he had ruled the western arm of the galaxy for 9,000 years. Warlord Cross of the Court Dominion occupied the second throne, and his people had crushed 100 rebellions through sheer military might over the centuries. The other 3 thrones belonged to the Zephyrian Collective and the Mordak Hierarchy, and the ancient Kelnari, who all radiated the same sense of superiority. Velkoth raised one of his forearms in a dismissive gesture, and his voice came through the translators sounding annoyed as he said the humans had been granted an audience, and should speak quickly because the council had important matters to discuss. Lisa stepped forward, and her footsteps echoed through the vast chamber as she spoke clearly and firmly, saying that humanity requested recognition as a sovereign military power with full voting rights and territorial autonomy. The chamber erupted in sounds that the translators turned into laughter from hundreds of different species, and Velkoth's mandibles clicked together in what looked like amusement as he said, "Humans had been traveling in space for barely 2 centuries, and species usually waited thousands of years for such recognition." And he asked what made humans think they deserved to stand among the eternal powers. Jake moved beside Lisa and said that humans had already proven themselves because in every conflict where the Council called on Terran forces as auxiliaries, they exceeded expectations and held lines that veteran alien soldiers abandoned and won battles that alien strategists declared impossible. Warlord Cross leaned forward on his throne, and his voice rumbled like stone grinding against stone as he said that auxiliaries did not get to dictate terms, and humans were useful tools, and nothing more than that. Lisa's expression hardened, and she said they were not asking for permission anymore but informing the Council of reality, and humanity would no longer serve as disposable shock troops while being denied basic rights, and they demanded equal standing, or they would withdraw from all Council operations immediately. The temperature in the chamber seemed to drop several degrees, and the 5 rulers exchanged glances with each other in a way that suggested they had dealt with this kind of defiance before, and knew exactly how to handle it. Velkoth's voice took on a sharp edge as he asked if humans dared to threaten the Council, and said that humanity existed because the Council allowed it, and human colonies thrived because the Council permitted trade within their systems. And he asked if humans truly wished to learn what happened to those who defied the eternal powers. Lisa pulled a data crystal from her pocket and threw it onto the floor, where it skittered across the smooth surface and came to rest at the base of Velkoth's throne platform. And she said it contained their formal declaration, and they had given the Council a choice and hoped they would choose wisdom. As Lisa and Jake turned to leave the chamber, Velkoth's words followed them like a curse, and he said that wisdom meant knowing one's place, and humans had just ensured the extinction of their species because the Council did not negotiate with primitives, and they would remind humanity why empires were eternal and why upstarts were forgotten. Jake glanced at Lisa as they walked through the grand doors and asked quietly if she thought the Council would really try to destroy humanity. And Lisa replied that they would certainly try, and that was exactly what humanity was, counting on behind them in the great chamber. The Eternal Five began making plans and owning their military commanders because they had crushed 1,000 rebellions over the millennia and conquered 1,000,000 worlds and lasted longer than most. Stars burned, and what was one more primitive species that needed to be taught a lesson in humility. They could not know that humanity had been preparing for this exact moment since the first time a Council member called them inferior savages, and every battle humans fought as auxiliaries had been a learning experience where they studied alien tactics, and every briefing they attended was intelligence gathering, and every restriction placed on them taught them about the enemy's weaknesses. Eternal empires were about to learn a harsh lesson about what happened when you underestimated a species that had clawed its way up from single-celled organisms through sheer stubbornness and the refusal to accept limitations. Humanity had spent decades being treated as second-class citizens in a galaxy that belonged to others, and they had smiled and nodded and said thank you for the opportunity to serve while secretly building weapons and training soldiers and making alliances with other species who were tired of being ruled by the so-called eternal powers. The Council thought this would be a simple police action to remind an upstart species of their place in the galactic order, and they expected to send their fleet to Earth and bombard a few cities and receive humanity's immediate surrender within days. They had no idea that humanity had been building a secret fleet in the outer darkness beyond the range of Council sensors and within asteroid fields and inside nebulae, where no one thought to look, because who would expect primitives to have the resources or knowledge to construct a proper war fleet? The war for humanity's freedom was about to begin, and the galaxy would never be the same again because humans had decided they would rather die fighting than live on their knees. And they were about to show the eternal empires that nothing in the universe was truly eternal, and that included the power of ancient civilizations who had grown comfortable and arrogant over thousands of years of easy dominance. In the cold vacuum of space, human warships were already moving into position, and crews were preparing for battle, and every single person knew what was at stake, because if they failed, their homeworld would burn, and their species would be enslaved or exterminated, but if they succeeded, they would change the entire structure of galactic civilization and prove that any power could be challenged, no matter how old or how strong it claimed to be. Admiral Karen Price stood on the bridge of the TFS Defiant watching the tactical display with intense focus, while around her the bridge crew worked in practiced silence, because each person was a specialist who had trained their entire life for this exact moment. Lieutenant Sam Foster looked up from his console and reported that all fleet elements had reached Rally Point Alpha, and 317 ships were reporting ready with drives hot and weapons armed, and crews at battle stations waiting for orders. Karen allowed herself a small smile because 317 warships was far more than the Council believed humanity possessed, since they thought humans had maybe 50 capital ships scraped together from converted mining platforms and old colony transports. But they had no idea about the massive construction effort that took place in the outer dark, beyond sensor range. She ordered communications to open a channel to all ships so everyone could hear what she was about to say. And when the channel opened, she straightened her shoulders and began speaking in a voice that carried the weight of steel. She told them that today they would stop pretending, because for decades, humans had played the role of grateful children who were thankful for scraps the Council threw their way, and they had bled on Council battlefields and died in Council wars, and been treated as expendable assets, and that ended now. She paused to let the words sink in across 300 ships and 60,000 crew members, and then continued saying that the Council fleet was already mobilizing and would arrive at Earth within 6 hours, expecting to find their homeworld defenseless and ready to be bombarded into submission, but instead they would find the human fleet waiting. She told them they were going to teach these ancient empires something they had forgotten over their thousands of years of comfortable dominance, and they were going to teach them fear, weapons officer. Danny Cole grinned and said it was about damn time, and the fleet began to move in a coordinated ballet of warships that should not exist. Each vessel represented a different approach to fighting enemies with superior technology, and the Defiant class carriers were built around strike-craft tactics that the Council had abandoned centuries ago, and the Armstrong-class destroyers were optimized for close-range fighting that most civilized species considered barbaric, and the Einstein-class ships were designed for electronic warfare that could turn enemy systems against them. The crown jewel was the Roosevelt, which was a dreadnought that took 15 years to build in secret, and it was a statement made in steel and fusion drives that humanity would not go quietly into extinction. On the Nexus station, the Eternal Five watched their fleet depart with satisfaction, because 4,000 vessels represented the combined might of 5 empires, and each ship was a veteran of countless campaigns, and they expected this to be over within a day. Velkoth reviewed the tactical data with casual interest and said the human homeworld had no significant defenses, and their auxiliary fleet was scattered across a dozen systems, and this would be a simple demonstration of power. Matriarch Silvara of the Kelnari said quietly that perhaps it was too simple, and the human ambassador had seemed almost eager for conflict, but Warlord Cross laughed and said eagerness meant nothing against 4,000 warships, and humanity would learn the price of defiance. What they did not know was that Lisa Grant stood in the war room deep beneath Earth's capital, watching the same tactical displays as Admiral Price and Colonel Pete Harris reported, that the Council fleet was on a direct course for Earth at maximum speed, and they were not even maintaining proper formation, because they thought this was just a police action. Lisa asked how long, until the human fleet intercepted them. And Pete said 4 hours and 30 minutes right at the Kuiper Belt, exactly as planned. General Amy Walsh studied the tactical board and said everything depended on the first 30 minutes, because if they could not break the Council's initial formation and convince them that humanity was a real threat, then the Council would adapt, and these empires had not lasted thousands of years by being stupid. Lisa said they would make sure the first 30 minutes counted and ordered Pete to signal Admiral Price to execute Operation Revelation. Back on the Defiant, Karen received the confirmation she had been waiting for and ordered all ships to break by task force and assume attack positions, and told them to remember their training and remember what they were fighting for, and remember that those Council ships were coming to destroy their families. She smiled coldly and said it was time to make the Council regret that decision, and ordered all ships to begin acceleration burn with time to intercept at 4 hours and 30 minutes, and told engineering she wanted every ounce of speed they could give her. The human fleet surged forward, with drives burning bright enough to be seen from nearby star systems. And they were not trying to hide anymore, because they wanted the Council to see them coming, on the Council command ship called Dominator Eternal. The sensor operator suddenly looked up in alarm and reported that he was detecting multiple drive signatures ahead, and there were hundreds of them, and they were military-grade fleet leader Ajikari. Barely glanced at the display and said it must be some kind of sensor malfunction, because humans did not have hundreds of military ships. The sensor operator insisted he was confirming the readings, and there were 300-plus warships of unknown class on an intercept course, heading directly toward them. Ajikari felt the first stirring of unease, because it should have been impossible since the Council had observers throughout human space, and they would have known about a fleet this size unless the humans had been hiding it specifically for this moment. He ordered all ships into combat formation Delta and told them to power weapons and shields, and demanded that someone get him more information about what they were about to face. In the cold darkness between worlds, two fleets rushed toward each other, and one represented the accumulated might of empires that had dominated the galaxy for thousands of years, and the other represented a single species that had decided it would rather die fighting than live on its knees. Neither side knew exactly what was about to happen when they met, but both were about to find out. And the Battle of the Kuiper Belt was only 4 hours away, and the entire galaxy seemed to be holding its breath, waiting to see if the Eternal Empires would crush another rebellion, or if something new and unprecedented was about to happen. Human crews checked their weapons one last time, and made peace with the fact that many of them would not survive the next few hours, but they were ready, because they knew what they were fighting for. And it was not glory or conquest, but simply the right to exist as free people in a galaxy that had tried to keep them subjugated. The first missiles launched when the fleets were still 2 million kilometers apart, and Terran tactical doctrine had always emphasized the opening salvo, based on the idea that the first punch could decide the entire fight, and Admiral Karen Price had turned that doctrine into an art form. She ordered all vertical launch systems to fire with full spread at maximum acceleration and across the human fleet. Thousands of missiles erupted from launch bays and streaked toward the Council fleet, at accelerations that would turn an unprotected human body into paste. On the Dominator, Eternal Fleet Leader Ajikari watched the missile swarm approach with contempt and ordered point defense systems to engage at leisure, because he believed these primitives actually thought missiles could penetrate Council shields. But something was wrong, because the missiles were not following predictable ballistic courses, and instead, they jinked and weaved with guidance systems that processed evasive maneuvers thousands of times per second, and there were so many of them filling the tactical display. The Council's point defense lasers began firing and tracking and sweeping space with coherent light, and missiles died by the hundreds, but hundreds more got through, and then thousands more. Someone on the bridge shouted for everyone to brace for impact, and the first wave hit the Council line like a hammer, and shields flared bright and then failed under the sustained assault, and ships that had fought for centuries, found themselves torn open by weapons that should not have been this effective, and the second wave hit before they could recover. Ajkari stared at his tactical display in disbelief and asked how these missiles were penetrating their defenses. What he did not know was that every time the Council deployed human auxiliaries, Jake Morrison and others like him had carefully noted every detail of Council weapons and shields and tactics, and human engineers spent years designing missiles specifically to defeat Council point defense systems, and they had studied failure modes and response times and targeting priorities. The missiles were smart, but more importantly, they were designed by a species that spent its entire spacefaring existence fighting at a technological disadvantage and learning how to win anyway. Ajkari ordered all ships to return fire and target the human capital ships and show them what real firepower looked like. The Council fleet opened up with plasma, lances and particle beams and gravity weapons that could tear ships apart at the molecular level, and the void lit up with enough energy to sterilize planets. The human fleet scattered like a school of fish and broke formation into hundreds of individual elements that twisted and dodged with maneuvers that should have killed their crews from the acceleration forces. The Council sensor operator reported in shock that the human ships were pulling 8G burns, and no known species could survive that level of acceleration. But humans could because humans had engineered themselves to do exactly that, through generations of genetic optimization and neural implants that coordinated with inertial dampeners and training that started before recruits could even walk properly, and the Council had technological superiority, but humanity had adapted on the defiant. Karen felt the crushing pressure of acceleration in her bones. Even through the dampeners and around her the bridge crew worked through the strain because they were enhanced by technology and sheer bloody-minded determination. She ordered all strike craft to launch and told all squadrons they were weapons-free. From the bellies of 20 carrier ships, fighter craft poured into space. And they were not graceful aerodynamic designs but brutal wedges of armor and thrust. And each one was piloted by someone who had grown up playing flight simulators that doubled as combat training. Lieutenant Sarah Mills led Raptor Squadron into the teeth of the Council formation, and her craft pulled maneuvers that would make a normal pilot blackout. And she told all Raptors that targeting priority was enemy command ships, and they needed to cut the head off this snake. The fighters dove into the Council fleet like angry hornets, and they were too small for capital ship weapons to track effectively, and too numerous for point defense to swat them all, and they carried plasma torpedoes that were guided by pilots who could outthink any automated system. Council ships began to die. And it was not the quick death of catastrophic explosion, but the slow death of system failures and drives knocked offline, and weapons disabled, and the human attack was surgical and precise and targeting weak points that should not have been known to anyone outside the Council. Ajkari realized with growing horror that the humans had their complete technical specifications and knew every weakness and every system vulnerability, and they had been studying the Council for decades. It was true because every Council ship that ever docked at a human station had been scanned down to the molecular level, and every piece of equipment sold to humanity had been reverse engineered and analyzed, and every technical manual had been quietly copied and shared, and the Council had created their own worst enemy by treating humanity as too primitive to be a threat. Ajkari ordered all ships to fall back to defensive formation beta so they could consolidate their forces, but the human fleet would not let them consolidate because Karen had studied every battle the Council ever fought, and she knew how they thought and how they adapted and what formations they favored, and she knew their greatest weakness. They had never fought an enemy that was willing to trade losses for advantage. She ordered all destroyers to ramming speed and told them to target the Council dreadnoughts. The Armstrong-class destroyers were already damaged with armor scorched and shields failing, but they had one last purpose to serve, and 20 ships broke formation and accelerated directly toward the Council's heaviest vessels, with drives screaming at maximum burn. The tactical officer on the Dominator Eternal shouted that the humans were going to ram them and said it was impossible because no commander would sacrifice ships like that. But Karen Price was not a Council commander, and she was human, and humans understood that sometimes you had to break every rule to win the fight. Half the destroyers were destroyed before reaching their targets, but 10 made it through, and 10 ships traveling at relativistic speeds carried enough kinetic energy to crack worlds and council dreadnoughts that had fought for thousands of years simply ceased to exist in spheres of expanding plasma. The council line broke, and for the first time in recorded history, a council fleet turned and ran from the battlefield. Karen ordered all ships to pursue and told them not to let the enemy reform and to keep the pressure on them on the Nexus station. The Eternal Five watched their fleet dissolve in real time, and for the first time in thousands of years, they felt something they had completely forgotten. They felt genuine. Fear Velkoth whispered and asked how primitives accomplished this on Earth. Lisa Grant allowed herself a smile as she watched the tactical display and said quietly that they accomplished it because they had something the Council forgot, and they had everything to lose, and a species with nothing to lose was the most dangerous thing in the entire universe. The battle was not over, and the war was not won, but humanity had proven something crucial to everyone watching. The Eternal Empires could bleed, and if they could bleed, then they could die. 3 days after the Battle of the Kuiper Belt, the Galactic Council convened an emergency session, and the crystalline halls of Nexus Station, that were usually filled with confident murmuring of eternal power, now echoed with heated arguments and bitter recriminations. High Arbiter Velkoth stood before the assembly, and his chitinous form somehow seemed smaller than before, as he reported that they lost 1,347 ships, which was 1/3 of the fleet they sent, while the humans lost only 82 vessels with another 100 damaged. The numbers hung in the air like an accusation that nobody wanted to acknowledge. Warlord Cross said it was impossible because no species defeated a council fleet at those kinds of ratios, especially not on their first major engagement. Matriarch Silvara of the Kelnari said quietly that perhaps it was not really their first engagement, because every time the council sent humans into battle as auxiliaries, they were studying council tactics, and every loss they suffered taught them about weaknesses, and the council had essentially trained their own executioners. The chamber erupted in overlapping voices as each species tried to assign blame and explain away the impossible, but beneath the chaos, a deeper truth was settling into everyone's minds. The Eternal Empires were not as eternal as they had believed. On Earth, the mood was completely different as military headquarters across the globe mixed celebration with grim determination because they had won a battle. But the war was far from over. Admiral Karen Price stood before a holographic display showing current fleet positions, and beside her, Colonel Pete Harris highlighted the Council's remaining forces. Pete reported that the Council had pulled back to defensive positions around their core worlds, and they had 15,000 ships scattered across 200 systems, and they were not coming at humanity in one big fleet again. Karen admitted that was smart of them, because humanity could not fight 15,000 ships even with all their tactical advantages, and the Council would grind them down through attrition if it came to a straight fight. Lisa Grant entered the room, and she was no longer just an ambassador, but now officially the Terran Federation's chief strategic coordinator, and she said the Council thought this was a military problem, and they thought they just needed more ships and better tactics and revised doctrine. Pete asked if it was not a military problem, and Lisa said it was actually a political problem, because the Council was an alliance of 5 empires with 5 separate power bases and competing interests held together only by mutual benefit, and the illusion of invincibility in humanity had just shattered that illusion. Karen caught on immediately and said they needed to make the Council fight each other. Lisa corrected her and said not fight but doubt, because the Vexhari lost the most ships in the battle, and the Court Dominion was already questioning why they should throw more resources at what they saw as a human problem, and the smaller member species were wondering if the Council could actually protect them anymore. She pulled up intelligence reports and communication intercepts and said, humanity could not win by fighting everyone at once, but they could win by making sure they were not fighting everyone at once, and they needed to fracture the Council politically. General Amy Walsh spoke up and said that would require more than just military victories, and they needed to offer alternatives and show other species that Council rule was not the only option available. Lisa said she was already working on it, and they had made quiet contact with 18 minor species who were civilizations that had been paying tribute to the Council for centuries and getting nothing in return except the privilege of not being conquered, and humanity had offered them something revolutionary. Karen asked what that was, and Lisa said trade agreements and technology sharing and mutual defense pacts and all the things the council promised but never actually delivered, and humanity was building their own alliance based on actual mutual benefit instead of threats and intimidation. Pete whistled softly and said that was brilliant, but also risky as hell. Because if the council found out before they were ready, they would crush those species to make an example. Lisa said that was exactly why they needed to move fast, and she changed the display to show a star system deep in council territory called the Kryn Commonwealth, and explained they were a mid-level industrial power that was not part of the council, but not independent either, and they were tired of paying protection money to the Vexhari, and she had been in contact with their leadership, and they wanted to defect. Karen said immediately that it was probably a trap. Lisa agreed. It probably was, but said if it was real then it was a chance to establish a foothold in council space and show others that resistance was actually possible. Karen asked what they would do if it was a trap, and Lisa said they would spring it and make the council pay dearly for it. Karen studied the star chart and calculated distances and response times and force requirements and said she could get a task force there in 2 weeks with 20 ships, which was enough to fight their way out if things went wrong, but not enough to provoke a full council response. Lisa told her to do it. 2 weeks later, Commander Jake Morrison led Task Force 17 into the Kryn system, half expecting to find a council fleet waiting in ambush, but instead they found exactly what Lisa had promised, which was a civilization ready to break free. Chancellor Adrian Ross of the Kryn Commonwealth met with Jake aboard the station orbiting Kryn Prime, and the Chancellor was humanoid, though taller and more slender than humans, with features that were both alien and somehow familiar. Adrian said they had been waiting for someone like humanity, which was a species willing to actually fight the council, because most species either surrendered or submitted or died, but humans had chosen a fourth option. Jake replied that humans just got stubborn, and it was kind of their thing. Adrian gestured to a star chart on the wall and said there were others like his people, and dozens of species who were tired of council dominance, but they needed to see that resistance was possible, and that the eternal empires could actually be challenged. Jake said they would see it, and humanity would make sure of it. What Jake did not know was that council intelligence had indeed learned of the meeting, but instead of responding with overwhelming force, they chose a more subtle approach. High Arbiter Velkoth sent a message to the Kryn Commonwealth that was broadcast on every available channel saying they had been misled by human propaganda and, if they returned to the council's protection, this momentary lapse would be forgiven, but if they continued down this path, they would share humanity's fate. Chancellor Ross's response was broadcast just as widely, and he said the council offered protection from threats they themselves created while humans offered genuine partnership, and he chose partners over overlords. Across the galaxy, species that had been quietly watching suddenly had a real choice placed before them, and choices once introduced could never be taken back. The political fractures began to show immediately as the Court Dominion announced they would not commit further military resources to the human conflict, and the Zephyrian Collective recalled their fleets to defend their own territory, and the Kelnari remained completely silent, neither supporting nor opposing continued military action. Only the Vexahari, with their pride wounded by their losses, demanded continued war, but suddenly they found themselves isolated, with their allies reluctant and their threats less effective than before. On Nexus Station, Velkoth raged at the other members of the Eternal Five and asked if they were simply going to accept this and let primitives dictate terms. Matriarch Silvara said coldly that they were accepting reality, because the humans had proven they could not be easily defeated, and the cost of subjugating them would be enormous, and the more they fought, the more they revealed weaknesses to others who might get similar ideas. Velkoth asked if they would do nothing, and Silvara replied that they would adapt, because all things must adapt or die. It was not the answer Velkoth wanted, but even he could see the truth now that the galaxy had fundamentally changed, and the age of eternal empires built on unquestioned supremacy was ending. A new age that was messy and uncertain and dangerous was beginning, and humanity had ensured they would have a strong voice in shaping it. 6 months after humanity's declaration of independence, the galaxy looked fundamentally different. Not in physical geography, which remained unchanged, but in the invisible lines of power and influence that really mattered to anyone paying attention. So Terran Federation now protected 18 formerly subjugated species, and each one was a pointed reminder that the Council's grip on the galaxy was slipping away, and human ships patrolled trade routes that had once been Council monopolies, and human technology flowed freely to civilizations that had been deliberately kept primitive by their former masters. In the war room beneath Earth's capital, Lisa Grant stood before the Joint Chiefs presenting the latest intelligence assessments, while holographic displays showed the strategic situation in 3 dimensions as a complex web of alliances and conflicts that grew more tangled by the day. She reported that the Vex-Hari were preparing another offensive, and they had massed 4,000 ships along their border with humanity's new allies, and they were going to try to break through before the alliance solidified further. General Amy Walsh asked if they could stop such a large force, and Lisa answered honestly that in a straight fight they could not, because humanity had 700 ships available and their allies could contribute maybe another 300, and they would be outnumbered 4-1. Admiral Karen Price, who had been promoted to Supreme Commander of Terran Defense Forces after the Kuiper Belt victory, said they would not fight straight then, and they had spent the last 6 months training their new allies in human tactical doctrine with hit-and-run tactics and ambush warfare and targeting supply lines instead of fighting traditional fleet actions. Pete Harris, who was now a general leading strategic planning, added that it would be guerrilla warfare on an interstellar scale, and they would make it expensive and endless, and make the Vex-Hari question whether conquering this region of space was worth the enormous cost. Lisa nodded and said that bought them time. But she asked time for what? Because they could not stay on a war footing forever, and eventually they needed a lasting resolution to this conflict. Emmy asked skeptically if Lisa meant peace because the Council did not do peace with equals, and they only understood subjugation or complete annihilation. Lisa said they would change what the Council actually was. Every head in the room turned to look at her, and Karen told her to explain. Lisa said the Galactic Council was already fractured badly, and the Court Dominion and Zephyrian Collective had effectively withdrawn from anti-human operations, and the Kelnari were wavering in their support. And only the Vex-Hari and Mordak hierarchy were still committed to maintaining the old order of things. She changed the display to show political alignments across the galaxy, and said they had been having quiet talks with the Kelnari, who were pragmatists at heart, and they could see that the Age of Empires was ending and they would rather adapt than die fighting. Yesterday's war, me said slowly that Lisa was talking about splitting the Council apart. Lisa said she was talking about replacing it entirely because the Council worked when it represented the strongest powers in the galaxy, and everyone else fell in line, but it had become bloated and corrupt and complacent, and what humanity was proposing was a new organization called the Galactic Commonwealth with voluntary membership, and no permanent ruling body and actual representation for all member species. Pete objected that the Vex-Hari would never accept such a radical change. Lisa agreed and said that was exactly why they were about to become the example that convinced everyone else to accept it. Karen leaned forward and asked what Lisa was planning. Lisa said the Vex-Hari offensive was going to fail completely, and humanity would make absolutely sure of it. And when the Vex-Hari had exhausted themselves trying to maintain their crumbling empire, humanity would offer an alternative to every species they ruled. She smiled coldly and said they were going to give the Vex-Hari the same choice humanity gave. The Council, which was submit to change or become irrelevant. The Vex-Hari offensive came 3 weeks later exactly as intelligence predicted, and 4,000 ships swept into the border regions, expecting to crush human and allied resistance through overwhelming numerical superiority. Instead, they found themselves fighting shadows that appeared and disappeared like ghosts, and human ships would materialize from nowhere and launch devastating strikes and vanish before the Vex-Hari could mount. Any effective response supply convoys disappeared without any trace left behind, and communication networks were disrupted by sophisticated electronic warfare that the Vex-Hari could not counter, and every single day the cost of the offensive mounted. Higher Commander Jake Morrison led a strike force that exemplified the new tactics perfectly, and 20 ships, including his flagship the Newton, hit a Vex-Hari logistics hub from 4 different vectors simultaneously, and they destroyed fuel depots and ammunition stores and repair facilities. and then were gone before the system's defensive fleet could even respond. Jake reported to Admiral Price that Phase 1 was complete, and the Vexahari 7th Fleet was now operating at 40% fuel capacity, and they would have to withdraw soon or risk being stranded deep in hostile territory. Karen told him it was excellent work, and said Phase 2 was about to begin. Phase 2 was pure political warfare, and as the Vexahari struggled to maintain their offensive, Lisa Grant released carefully edited footage of the campaign to every galactic media outlet she could reach. Images of massive Vexahari fleets being outmaneuvered by much smaller human forces flooded the networks and interviews, with species liberated from Vexahari rule, talked about the prosperity and freedom they found under protection of the new alliance. Most importantly, financial data showed exactly how much the Vexahari were spending to maintain their empire, and how little they were actually getting in return for that investment. High Arbiter Velkoth raged at an emergency council session and called it propaganda and human lies, designed specifically to undermine Vexahari authority. But the other members of the Eternal Five were doing their own calculations now, and Matriarch Silvara spoke what others were thinking when she said that lies required actual falsehood. But these were merely uncomfortable facts presented inconveniently. She turned her multifaceted eyes to Velkoth and said the humans had demonstrated that warfare against them was expensive and ineffective, and they had demonstrated that alternative political structures were actually viable, and they had demonstrated that their civilization was not as eternal as they claimed. She said perhaps it was time to accept that the galaxy had changed and they could change with it, or they could follow all the extinct species they read about in archaeological surveys. The vote, when it finally came, was not even close, and 4-1 the Eternal Five voted to open negotiations with the Terran Federation and its allies for the formation of a completely new galactic government. Only, the Vexahari refused, with Velkoth declaring that his people would never bow to primitives. 6 months later, the Vexahari Empire collapsed from within. As species, they had ruled for millennia, declared independence emboldened by human support, and the obvious weakness of their former masters, and the mighty Vexahari who had crushed 1,000 rebellions found themselves unable to suppress dozens of simultaneous uprisings. Within a year, they sued for peace on human terms. The first session of the Galactic Commonwealth convened on a neutral station that was newly constructed for exactly this purpose, and instead of 5 thrones raised above hundreds of subservient species, there was a circular chamber where all members sat as equals. Ambassador Lisa Grant addressed the assembly, and her words were broadcast across the entire galaxy to anyone who wanted to listen. She said that for thousands of years the galaxy was ruled by empires that claimed their power was eternal, and they claimed their dominance was the natural order, and that some species were born to rule while others were born to serve, and they were wrong about all of it. She looked around the chamber, making eye contact with representatives from hundreds of different worlds. She said humanity did not defeat the Council through superior technology or vast resources, but by refusing to accept that any power was truly eternal, and by showing others that resistance was actually possible, and by offering something better than empire. She said they offered partnership and mutual benefit and the revolutionary idea that all species deserved to chart their own destiny. Lisa paused and said, "The empires claimed power eternal, but humanity showed them that the only eternal thing was change, and the only question that mattered was whether they changed by choice or by force, and today they were choosing, and today they were building something new." She said they were not building an empire but a commonwealth, and not creating subjects, but partners. She declared that today they proved the age of empires was over, and the age of cooperation had begun. The vote to ratify the Commonwealth Charter was nearly unanimous, with only the Vexahari and a handful of their most loyal followers abstaining in bitter isolation. Years later, historians would debate endlessly about the significance of humanity's rebellion, and some would claim it was inevitable, and the old empires were already declining, and humans merely hastened a process that was already underway, while others would argue that without humanity's intervention, the Council might have lasted another 1,000 years.